catastrophic is how the UN describes the food crisis in the Gaza Strip. Officials are pressuring Israel to provide more access for food trucks.
Israel, on the other hand, says more than enough food is getting into Gaza. The problem? The UN and Hamas aren't distributing the aid to those in need. Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
UN officials say not enough food is getting in to the more than 2 million Gazans.
We have enough food to feed the entire population of Gaza. That food at the moment is outside the Gaza Strip. We need land crossings, we need access to get it into Gaza, whether in the southern parts of the Gaza or the northern part of Gaza, because the situation is catastrophic.
However, Israel says record amounts of humanitarian aid are getting into Gaza, the equivalent of 3 pounds of food per person per day.
There are no limits on incoming aid, and in fact there is excess capacity at the Israeli crossings, both Kerem Shalom, where goods enter Gaza directly, and Nitzana. And the best evidence of that excess capacity is that last week we hit a record 277 aid trucks a day, with 255 entering yesterday.
Levy says the problem is distribution inside Gaza and the UN relying on Hamas for protection.
The UN is struggling to distribute aid at the pace that Israel is letting it in. And the reason is that the UN relies on UNRWA, which is a Hamas front. That is why aid is piling up undistributed on the Gazan side of the crossing.
Observers on the group posting this video said to show Hamas commandeering aid trucks entering Gaza. Meanwhile, Houthi attacks on Red Sea and Gulf of Aden shipping intensifying as a missile strike on a ship killed 2 crew members. This just days after an attack resulted in the sinking of a commercial ship. And on Capitol Hill, hostage family members met with lawmakers to plead for the release of their loved ones from Hamas captivity.
We call on our president and all the parties involved to do whatever they can to bring our loved ones back home. I hope to believe that my fellow U.S. citizens remember the fact that there are 8 U.S. hostages.
Hopes for a deal to free the remaining hostages are fading since Hamas is refusing terms agreed to by the U.S. and Israel. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thank you, Chris. In other news, the U.S. faces a looming crisis as high interest rates and unchecked government spending are driving up the national debt. Ephraim Graham has that story and more from the CBN Newsroom. Ephraim?
Andrew, America's debt is growing $1 trillion every 100 days. Economists warn if Congress doesn't take action, it's only going to get worse. CBN's Brody Carter takes a closer look.
U.S. national debt, the money our federal government borrows to cover operating expenses, now stands at more than $34 trillion. If that's not bad enough, the high interest rates and the crushing payments on that debt are spiraling the crisis out of control.
Right now, we're paying about $750 billion per year in interest costs, which again is approximately equal to the amount that the United States spends on national defense, if you can believe it.
Professor Alexander Salter, Ph.D. and economic analyst, says some forecasts expect the interest payments alone to double by 2033 from its current level to $1.4 trillion. The U.S. is set to spend around $870 billion in interest payments this year. That's more than America spends on the Department of Defense and our national security. Salter says the biggest drivers of the growing national debt are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, leaving the federal government required to pay an estimated $200 trillion in future obligations.
This is why we have to understand that military aid to Ukraine or Israel, we can debate those issues on their merits, and we should. But if we're talking 50 billion, 100 million, that is a drop in the bucket in terms of the long-run fiscal trajectory. We're not going to fix things by shaving things off. We need fundamental structural reforms.
Economists agree that the risk to America's credit rating and its ability to raise funds makes debt likely to become one of the biggest threats to our national security because the U.S. wouldn't be able to afford the military resources it will need.
If you need to protect the country in a security sense, you need to be able to do that. If you can't place your bonds, you can't command resources. If you can't command resources, you can't pay for tanks and fighter planes and bombs and all the things that you need to keep the country safe.
And we are paying for it now with these high inflation rates. And sorry to be the messenger of bad news, it is going to get far worse in the coming decades.
Economist Joel Griffith with the Heritage Foundation.
Of course, have a presidential election coming up, and it's very important that we have a candid discussion and debate about what these candidates would do to stop us from going off of the fiscal cliff.
Brody Carter, CBN News.
Staying on the topic of federal spending and a potential government shutdown, the House passed 6 spending bills Wednesday, providing more than $450 billion to fund the Departments of Justice, Energy, and Veteran Affairs, among others. It now goes to the Senate for a vote before Friday's deadline. Congress is facing a second deadline, March 22nd, to fund more departments, including Defense, Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services. President Biden appears before Congress to make his annual State of the Union speech tonight. The administration is calling the moment a reset. A Real Clear Politics poll shows 57% of Americans disapprove of the president's job performance. CBN will have live coverage and analysis of the speech and the Republican response. You can watch it on our CBN News platforms beginning at 8:45 Eastern Time. Be sure to watch Friday's 700 Club for a full wrap and response. The president is expected to call for more military aid to Ukraine tonight as the war enters its 3rd year. There's concern Russia now has its eye on the tiny country of Moldova. If Russia invade, Moldova's small evangelical community would face a dangerous future. CBN's George Thomas brings us this exclusive report from inside the region.
Alexander Belev remembers when, at 7 years old, 4 Russian KGB officers showed up at his parents' home in Moldova.
All us 5 siblings had to sit in one room as they searched the house for Christian literature, Bibles, and anything related to Christianity.
The agents found all sorts of Christian literature in the house that morning in 1982. They hauled Belev's father, a prominent underground Baptist pastor, off to prison, where he spent the next 2.5 years behind bars for his faith. This is video captured secretly that day of his father being led through prison gates. Several weeks later, the young Belev would visit his father. Belev, pastor of a church here in Moldova's capital city, Chisinau, now faces the prospect of enduring the same Christian persecution his father suffered 42 years ago.
2 years after the war in Ukraine, we know the very real scenario that Russia could easily invade Moldova, and if that happens, we'll have the same type of persecution that is happening today in the Ukrainian territories occupied by Russia and like it was during Soviet times.
Home to roughly 3 million people, Moldova sits between Ukraine and Romania. Russia's war against Ukrainian forces raging barely 100 miles from Moldova's border.
I have no doubt that the Russian military planning has an invasion of Moldova on its books, something they're thinking about and something they can easily do if they want to test the West.
So far, Ukraine has managed to stop Russians from advancing west of Kherson in their drive to take key strategic cities like Mykolaiv and Odessa, and likely preventing a potential march on Moldova.
Again, we are very thankful to Ukraine for their resistance because this is a guarantee for the peace in Moldova.
The spark that could ignite a potential Russian invasion of Moldova could happen right here in a region known as Transnistria. CBN News traveled to the pro-Russian breakaway territory of Moldova's northern front along Ukraine's border, where Moscow has in recent months stirred up political turmoil. We made our way through several checkpoints manned by Russian troops to the region's capital of Tiraspol, where a huge statue of Lenin adorns the town square. Pro-Russian rebels here have asked President Vladimir Putin for protection against what they claim are economic threats from Moldova's government. While the majority here in Transnistria would rather be part of Russia, they know that Moldova's recent tilt west and desire to join the European Union are giving the Kremlin heartburn. Experts believe Putin is using Transnistria as a Russian proxy to scuttle Moldova's EU aspirations.
People are more anxious. They're concerned about their fate and the possibility that they be forced to leave their homes because of an invasion.
Analysts warn that if Ukraine falls to Russia, Moldova will most certainly be the Kremlin's next target. George Thomas, CBN News, reporting from Chisinau, Moldova, and Tiraspol, Transnistria.
A story you're sure not to see anywhere else. Andrew?
Thank you, Ephraim and George, for your report. You know, and included in there is such a reminder to us of the persecution our international brothers and sisters in Christ face.
You know, it's so hard sometimes to stay on top of it all because it's so worldwide. But Transnistria is a place where Orphans Promise has a very large project that we support through a church there, working with children who are vulnerable and compromised. And just pray for these people, because these are Christians who are truly having to stand for their faith in the face of much evil. And they need us. They just beg for prayer from our country here and freedom here.